Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Shared State, curated by Jordan Busher and Natalie Lindies. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist Jen P. Harris. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions. We'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation in bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks all, and welcome, Jen.
You cats. And thank you all for being here. I also want to just thank Jordan and Natalie for inviting me to be in the show down in Columbus. And if you do happen to be in Columbus or come through Columbus this summer, the show's up for another month or so. It's up until some point in July. And it's a great show with a lot of great Ohio artists. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to just jump right in here. And by way of introduction, I'm actually going to read a short statement I wrote about a year ago, so last summer, which, as statements go, I think they are always evolving for me. So this feels like it's like a time capsule from last summer. And there are other thoughts I'm going to share throughout the talk, but as a sort of framing device, I wanted to start with this. And I'll show a few of the images from the exhibition in Columbus. So this is one of them. For 10 years, I searched for a mode of working that would allow me to escape the kind of figurative painting I made as a young artist, because that old way of working no longer satisfied my need for a way to churn the world. In 2023, I found weaving. The constraints of the loom were just what I needed to counter the paralyzing open-endedness of non-mimetic painting. In textile space, aesthetics develop spontaneously around the specific architecture of a weave. With painting, 1,000 decisions must be made. In my loom paintings, paint and weave face off, setting up disparate aesthetic concerns. For me, this clash is an engine of form and meaning, both in the way it juxtaposes gestural marks made with a brush with the structured visual phenomena formed by the organization of thread, but also in the way it flips art historical conventions by positioning woven cloth on top of paint. This departure from the material hierarchy of paint over canvas, this repositioning of cloth, conventionally rendered invisible and inert by paint, as an agent with a presence all its own, is quite possibly the thing I was searching for all those years. It lets me stir things up. Working with the thread has become the method by which I can make visible that which I sense in the painting, but cannot reach with paint alone. That which I can feel as a presence, but which is not yet overt. Like the way you sometimes dream about someone you haven't seen in a very long time, the night before you run into them in the grocery store. So with that, I'm going to actually jump back in time and start at the very beginning and kind of take you through the development of my work in some key pivot points, essentially. So I grew up in Baltimore, and this is a photograph of the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Cone Collection, which was, I would say, probably my earliest kind of exposure to art was going to this museum. There's a lot of modernist painting in this collection, Matisse, Cézanne, Picasso, really the modernist canon, and that's kind of where I started. And I started painting when I was quite young. I was 15 years old. I was lucky to go to a really great public high school that had a good art department. And then the other sort of early influence was magazines. These were two that I remember getting the Smithsonian. My parents had subscriptions to both Smithsonian Magazine and also a number of architectural magazines because they're both architects. So I was again getting kind of through the Smithsonian exposure to maybe more global art historical context, and through these architecture magazines, more of a design, architecture and design kind of context. And all these influences are still present in the work I'm making today. So the training I actually had in painting and drawing was in observational painting and drawing, so very traditional. This is a painting I probably made when I was around 19, when I was an undergraduate at Yale University. And I was fortunate, this painting was made in Rome, in Italy, and I was very fortunate to be able to spend a number of summers in Italy around that time when I was in my late teens and early 20s. First as a student at an art school in Umbria, where I was studying landscape painting and making plein air landscape paintings like this one. And then as a staff member at that art school for a few summers. And also influential around this time was the class I took on color. So it was based on Joseph Albers' Interaction of Color book. And the professors that I studied with were students of Joseph Albers. So it was very like direct kind of access to that Bauhaus lineage. And I actually am like still thinking about the kind of color games that Albers introduces in this book today in the work I'm making with paint and yarn. So when I was in my 20s, after college, I had a bit of a crisis, like a bit of an identity crisis, but as also an artistic crisis, I would say. I came out as a lesbian, and really everything that I thought was certain, including what I thought, you know, what kind of painting I was going to make, what kind of artist I was, even the fact that I thought I was going to be an artist kind of came into question for me. Sort of questioned everything that I had sort of taken for granted up until that point, with this big shift in my life. And when I actually stopped painting for a while. And when I came back to painting, my approach and my subject matter was different. And this is one of the earliest paintings I made during that period in graduate school. So it's in graduate school in New York City at Queens College, out in Flushing. And I was working with a figurative painter named Kurt Kauper, and I think he had a big impact on me at that point as I was trying to figure out what to do and thinking more about my identity and how to bring that into my work as a subject. And so I started working more with invention using photographic sources, so less so from life and more so, you know, from images as I was gathering and then sort of reassembling and collaging together. So thinking less about observation and more about invention, so that I could kind of invent these images that felt like they connected with the experience I was going through. And yeah, so I'm just showing you a couple of these, but I was really thinking through ideas about queer representation and trying to find a visual language for my own experience, kind of asking questions like, you know, who am I? How do I want to be seen in the world? But also feeling kind of playful about it. So I've always thought this painting is very funny. It's like kind of I've made a lot of these paintings of these kind of androgynous pairs, like the one before as well, where it's almost like an internal space. And in this one, there's, you know, one making juice and drinking juice and the other one smoking cigarettes. And it's kind of like, you know, virtue and vice or something like that. And these kind of conflicting forces potentially. But I was also really taking pleasure in the luminosity and the vibrancy of oil paint. So these are oil and linen. Also at the same time, I was working as a graphic designer. And so I was doing things like making murals. So the one on the right is a mural for a client. I think it was some kind of local food store. And I was also making flyers, and I was designing my own hand-painted, hand-printed t-shirts and selling them on the streets of New York. And all of this was happening in the same studio as my painting. So the work I was doing in design started to influence the graphic language I was using in my painting, and these kind of flat, more graphic areas of color and composition came into the paintings. And I was kind of interested in this simplification of form I was finding through this. Like, for example, this like lightning bolt shape here, like this sort of flattening of the shapes and forms, because it felt like this removal of detail was able to speak to my experience as a queer person in the way that it introduced ambiguity to the image. Like there was more to fill in, less definition. And this was interesting to me. I was thinking about ambiguity as not a problem to be solved so much as a condition to be engaged. And this work, which I was making for several years after graduate school, led to my first significant exhibition, which was a solo show in New York at a gallery called Daniel Cooney Fine Art. And this gallery was focused primarily on queer photography. So my work was a little bit of an anomaly in the gallery program, but it made sense because I was working still with these photographic images, and there was still this kind of photographic space in the work, even though they were paintings and drawings. And I mean, obviously this was a big moment for me to have this show, and I got a few other grants and things, so I was finding like some early success through this work. But interestingly enough, this success and the kind of way that people were engaging with the work made me question whether I wanted to keep making it. It made me question whether I wanted to keep working with photographic sources. And it also made me question the subject matter, because what I was finding was that I was kind of the work was being appreciated for its subject matter only by queer audiences, but it wasn't really, I was interested in a lot more than just the subject. I was interested in the things that were happening with the painting, the way I was painting it, more of the formal and conceptual sort of backdrops to how I was actually making the work. And that wasn't what people were seeing or wanting to talk about. And so I, was having some questions about whether I wanted to continue making this work. And at the same time, I was also doing some drawing performance. And so I wanted to show this because I feel like this, I'm just going to show a short clip, and talk about how I was thinking about this. But this type of performance was helping me to access something about image making through time-based media that I hadn't yet articulated through the paintings I was making. And so this was part of a performance called Discommodify, which was in Bushwick, Brooklyn in 2011. And it was curated by a poet and a visual artist. And what they did is they paired queer poets and artists together to do a collaborative performance. And so I was paired with the poet Max Crandall, and Max was wrote a poem and was reading the poem out loud as I was drawing. And so what you're seeing is the projection, and this is, someone just holding a camera, obviously. And it's a projection screen. I was sitting at the back of the room drawing on a tablet on my laptop, and the drawing, in real time as the poem was being read. And the thing that I became interested in here was that, as you can see, the drawing sort of starts out as this kind of abstract form. It's not something you can necessarily name. A lot of people sort of identified it as maybe something like a coastline, maybe from above. But I'm going to skip forward to show you a little bit later, it starts to come into focus as actually two figures. And this is quite long, so I'm just going to jump so you can see. But the moment so it was like two sailors. So it was an image that was similar to some of the paintings I was making, but there was something about that shift in perception that was really interesting to me. That moment when I could sense that the audience could grasp the image And that pivot point was really interesting to me. This moment when it's like you can't quite grasp it, and then you can, or it's like the image is the recognizable image is kind of like elusive, but then it sort of gives you a hint. So that's something I still think about today, and I found that this project actually really helped me to identify that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. Let me see how I do that. It's like stuck here. There we go. Okay, so around this time, I ended up leaving New York City, and I'm going through this as a chronology because I feel like each of these kind of stages in this period of my life were pretty pivotal. So I left New York City in 2012 and moved upstate to a city called Hudson. And I lived in a house, that's the one on the left there, that had space. Like, it had a big living room. It had space that I never had when I lived in the city. And I was, I got there and I thought, what am I going to do with this space? I was looking for community in this new place. And I realized, well, I have this big living room. I could do something with it. I could invite people over. I could host something. And what I ended up doing was organizing, basically it was a salon. It was artists and writers who were living in this part of New York, who had chosen to leave New York City, but who were all really serious about their art practice. And we created a space where we could basically share in-progress work, share process questions, research that we were doing. And I called this the Hudson Incubator. And I think there's at least one person here on this Zoom, and that was part of that. It was really, we also curated some exhibitions, but it really was this very supportive space and this strong community, artistic community outside of the art center. And this is something that has continued to be important to me. And what I found with this project, it was about 2 years long, we did this, is that it really gave me the confidence and the support I needed to make a break in my work, the break I was starting to think about when I had that show, and was questioning whether I wanted to continue with the photo-based work. And so I started to think less about queer representation and more about how to explore and express the unrepresentable. So like a sort of more internal experience. And I shifted away from photographic sources and began using more art historical materials, so prints and drawings, many of them from the medieval period, and was kind of interested in the line quality of that time period in art history, and also the way that the figures were kind of awkward. And I felt like there was this sort of latent queerness in the bodily gestures that I could sort of tap into and sort of make my own. And I started working with ink as well. So this is ink on paper, and it's pouring the ink and then drawing into it. And sort of there was more chance built into this process. So it was really this shift away from, originally it was observational painting and then kind of invention through construction. And now, like, I felt like this was a shift more towards exploring a process and letting the process kind of lead me to an image. And I, made a lot of these. These are they're pretty small for the most part, but also thinking about, exploring the boundaries between a body and a space, or a body in the world. I was working with tarot cards, so thinking about sort of symbolic space as well. And often the bodies in these sort of felt, or the space I was creating felt like kind of a cipher for my own body. So rather than actually representing a body from a photograph, it was like kind of more of a sensation of that experience. And I'm jumping ahead here now. This is some years later, but still ink on paper. And this was in 2016 when Trump was first elected. And I was feeling quite dark and making these paintings that were getting quite dense and literally dark. As you can see, there's I'm still using a lot of the same kind of source material, but I was also introducing video game imagery and some botanical things. There were some other projects in between the work I just showed you in this that were influencing this. But I felt like these were like, I don't know, energetically, I didn't necessarily love what this work was doing and what it was bringing into the world. And I was pretty frustrated. And so in sort of a fit of frustration, one day I actually just cut up a bunch of the paintings that were in my studio into these strips. And this was the beginning of a very like exciting period in my practice. So I found that by cutting up the paintings, I could kind of reactivate and reinvent what was in those paintings to begin with. And so I started constructing new paintings with the strips from the old paintings, essentially, basically like this composting process. And I felt like, these allowed me to kind of, I don't know, this is the first time I started thinking about kind of like optical vibration and a kind of movement in the piece as opposed to, sort of objectness that I was working with before. And, kind of a way of releasing energy. So I worked on this body of work for 3 years. I didn't pick up a paintbrush. I didn't pick up, any ink or paint. It was just cutting and gluing together, essentially. And it was really a process that took me into like totally unknown places. So this was really exciting for me. It felt like it was what I had been searching for when I left the original figurative painting, was trying to find some kind of process that could take me somewhere unexpected. And to make these, I would work sort of piece by piece. These are quite large, actually. This one is 60 by 80 inches. And this one's 80 by 60, so they're bigger than me. This one's maybe a little bit smaller, but I would work on them in sections. So I'd kind of start with, one area of just laying things out on a table and sort of finding something that felt like it was dynamic, and then glue it down and step back and then, keep building it. So there was also this process of kind of discovering the image as I was making it. It felt really exciting to me. Felt like I was a little bit less in control of what I was doing, which I started to trust. I was trusting my hands as opposed to my brain a little bit more. And thinking, this is also when I started to think about quilts and pixels and tiles and these kind of more craft-based, pattern-based traditions that continued to stay with me. And this sort of slow and labor-intensive process of making these works also gave me a chance to kind of, it was sort of almost like a ritual. It gave me a chance to kind of grieve and process what was happening in the world. So I was making that work as the pandemic hit, and I was, like many people, I was out of my studio for a while, and I ended up by chance having this graph paper in my house, in my apartment, and started making these tiny colored pencil drawings and using that graph paper. So already I had been kind of working with vibration and sort of grid-based structure in those collage-based paintings. And I found a way to sort of carry some of those ideas over into these tiny drawings. So these are 9 by 6 inches. And I was really thinking a lot about the experience that we were all going through, where it felt like one pattern of living was colliding with a new pattern of living, and sort of asking like how to make a picture of that, essentially. So I would start these with these kind of swooping line drawings and then build the grid of color around those. So these two kind of types of images were kind of in tension and competing for visibility. And these drawings evolved over the course of several years. I mean, they were kind of my primary practice for maybe like 2.5 years or so. And this is when I started to think about weaving, is when I was making these, for obvious reasons, perhaps, but there's kind of this warp and weft, this vertical and horizontal structure. And I just kept having conversations about weaving with people. And I ended up, at the time, I was not living in Cleveland yet when I was making these. I was actually in Los Angeles. But I had heard about this place called Praxis Fiber Workshop in Cleveland, Ohio. And I signed up to take an online course in weave structure, like basically file design for using a digital jacquard style loom at Praxis that they had a residency program for. So it was like a computer driven loom where you could design a file and then weave by hand with the computer file basically talking to the loom to create a pictorial image. And I thought this was fantastic. I thought, well, if I learn this, I could make large scale weavings based on my drawings. And that was kind of how I thought about weaving initially. And by chance, I ended up moving to Cleveland. That's a whole other story. But when I got here, I finally got my hands on this loom, and you're seeing me there at doing a residency at Praxis. The left is showing the loom with my warp, which I had painted. So it's got some color gradients in it. So I prepared the warp, and then I set off on this 2-week residency to make basically large scale versions of my drawings. And you can see that here on the right. It's kind of a similar grid-based structure. As I was weaving, however, what I discovered was that I didn't understand how this was all happening. Like, this was amazing to me. I could draw a line with through the loom, but I felt like it was happening so fast, and with the computer involvement, like I felt like I still didn't really understand what was happening, and then I wanted to deconstruct it further. And so after that experience with that loom, I actually took an introduction to weaving course at Praxis also, and learned very basic things. Learned how to do plain weave, learned how to set up a loom, how to make a plain weave, which is just a basic over-under structure, and some other basic weave structures. And this was better. I felt like I could sort of wrap my brain around what was happening, but I still felt like I needed to do it with my own hands. Like the elaborate machinery of the loom, even a basic floor loom, still felt like it was like kind of in between me and understanding how to work with this technology. And by chance, I was playing around in my studio and sort of laid some thread on a panel that was painted. So you can see some of that on the floor there. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, like the interaction, sort of optical vibration between the yarn and the painted lines is doing something kind of unique. And so I decided to actually turn one of these paintings into a loom by hammering nails into it and putting warp, which is the yarn under tension, onto it, and then weaving with a needle on top of the painting. So that was kind of how it started. And it was just an experiment. I didn't really know what would happen, but it turns out it opened up this whole new field of possibilities. This is one of the first loom paintings I made, and this was called Veil. And this was in 2023. And as I alluded to in the beginning of the talk, when I read that statement, the painting and the weaving both have to contribute something to the conversation. And this was the first piece where I felt like that was really happening, or that what was happening in the painting and what was happening on top in the weaving, they were in dialogue, and they were creating something new, basically a third thing that was not, I wouldn't be able to create with the painting or with the weaving alone. And that was very exciting. So for the last year or so, I've been experimenting with making larger works, but also shifting the way I'm thinking about the woven shapes in relation to the painting. So I'm thinking about the woven shapes as kind of these framing devices for the painted forms, and that kind of impacts what's required of the painting in the painted layer. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about source material and process, because I feel like this is often the kind of questions I get. So the forms in the recent works are derived still from often medieval prints and drawings, which I've been working with for like 10 years now. But also more recently, some images from antiquity, and also from the structure of the weaves themselves. I'm particularly drawn to these kind of bizarre drawings from the medieval period because they're often from manuscripts, which are basically like ancient comic books, and I kind of love the strangeness of them. But I definitely sort of zoom in and extract elements from them for my own purposes. So I'm not so interested in the narrative quality of the images as the formal language that and the sort of feeling that they convey. But this is often what generates the line work. I generate the line work in the paintings from images like that. And you can see they get translated and transformed quite a bit. And the people often ask if I preconceived the composition of these pieces. And I definitely don't. It's very much a responsive process. It's a kind of, I make the painting and then I put the warp on and then I start working with the shape and then I stand back and, it's a really, I think my background as a painter is really evident. It's like I'm working still as a painter, even though I'm using yarn. But I do make these little drawings. I've started making these little drawings over the last year and a half or so that are guides for the shapes that I'm weaving. So it allows me to kind of, set out with intention to weave a particular shape, but then within that shape, there can be lots of variation, shifts in color, and decisions that are made as I'm weaving that shape. But, each of these shapes will take anywhere from 1 to 4 hours to weave, because I'm doing this with a needle and yarn by hand. And so there's a lot of what I'm doing is, these shifts allow me to, it happens very slowly. It allows me to kind of evolve the composition of the piece at this snail's pace, but it also keeps me engaged. And again, it kind of goes back to that notion of like a ritualistic process that allows me to kind of be processing as I'm working. And that's something that, started with those collage-based pieces that is still really a central part of my practice. Okay, so I'm going to now I'm going to sort of finish up by showing images of my most recent body of work, which is currently on view at an exhibition called Thrum, my solo show in Cleveland at Abattoir Gallery. And I'm going to kind of take you through the entire exhibition. But to start with, as a way to contextualize it, I actually want to, I'm going to read this quote from Sam Adams. This is a new essay about my work that was published in a booklet for the exhibition. And I feel like, and this is where I got the title from the show, but I also feel like Sam really hits on something here that I will talk about a little bit more. So I'll just read this. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe describes in his 1810 treatise, The Theory of Colors, the mixing of colors such as blue and yellow to create green. The respective qualities do not therefore destroy each other, for if in this intermixture the ingredients are so perfectly balanced that neither is to be distinctly recognized, the union again acquires a specific character. It appears as a quality by itself by which we no longer think of combination. Given the thrum between Harris's painted support and the woven top layer, we might extend Goethe's paradigm to the perception of both color and textural mixing that occurs in the quarter-inch space between the densely strung fibers and the painted ground beneath them. In mixing two elements, painting and weaving, as Goethe describes, Harris creates a third type of image with unique properties and characteristics. So this feels to me like it's really kind of the heart of the work, actually, this third creation of this third thing. And for me, it has a lot to do with vibration. And this work is very new, so I'm still kind of honing in on language for it and, understanding it myself. I'm a very intuitive artist, so I'm working with the material, with the process, and finding the ideas through the making process. And so the language that I put around the work comes later, and it's still evolving for this body of work. But I do think that this kind of third thing, this kind of space between the painting and weaving, this in-betweenness, is really at the heart of what I'm working with in this project. And when I say project, I just mean this whole endeavor of making the loom paintings. And this in-betweenness goes back to, these questions I was having initially with the figurative painting around, identity. It's still thinking about identity, but in a very different way, a much more open way, a much more complex way, I think. Thinking more about gender identity, an ungendered subjectivity or non-binary subjectivity, and the kind of slipperiness and in-betweenness and opacity of that. And the vibration feels like it's this place where that energetic in-betweenness is released. And it's really a vibration that's created by the interaction of the yarn and the paint together. And I think what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to read one more passage as I kind of go through these images. And this is something I'm just reading now. It's a book by Elizabeth Gross called Chaos, Territory, and Art. And she's talking about philosophy, and it's a pretty dense book, but there's this one paragraph I was reading just actually earlier this morning that I think kind of speaks to, or like puts words around some of the like elusive ideas about vibration that I've been having. The artistic release and propagation of sensation, which, as we will further consider in the following chapter, is always a mode of resonance and harmonious vibration, an oscillation extracted from the fluctuating, self-differentiating structure of the universe itself, used to pace, measure, and provide discernment in a universe in which nothing is self-identical. All substance is movement, modes of contraction, dilation, or difference, repetition, and generates not only perceptions, that is, auditory and visual images, but above all, rhythm. Rhythm explodes auditorially in and as music, and visually in and as painting and the visual arts. Rhythm is what connects the most elementary and primitive bodily structures of even the most simple organisms to the implacable movements of the universe itself. Art as music, sculpture, painting, architecture, dance, resonates or transmits force through every structure. This force must be considered not as the product of mankind, an invention that distinguishes the human from the animal, but rather a non-human, unlivable power. That's my timer to make sure I'm on track. That runs through all of life and connects the living in its various forms to the non-organic forces and qualities of materiality itself. So this show is on view until June 27th. If you happen to come through Cleveland, I'd be happy to meet you at the gallery. And also happy to send a PDF of the essay that Sam wrote. If you're interested, you could email me. And that's it. So this is a photo of the show down in Columbus with 4 of my works over on the right side there. And that's the last slide.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jen. Folks, if you have questions, pop them into the chat and we will get to them. I have a curiosity about, like, I love seeing the kind of linear quality, the story strung together. And something that strikes me is your openness to sitting in unrest and discovery there. And so I'm curious, how is it that you provide yourself the grace and openness for moving out of something that has given you success or perceived success in one way or another to move into a new mode or opus, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly what's the word that my mother used to describe me? One word is persistence, perhaps, but the other is stubbornness. There's two, like, it's like the positive and negative connotation of the same quality, I guess. But I do have a kind of restlessness, and I guess in time I've accepted it. I mean, I think the first break was really hard. Like in New York, when I was just out of graduate school and I had this idea about becoming an artist, and I have a solo show in New York, it's like, okay, I've done it. You know, I can just keep doing that. You know, that was the hardest break. But I thought I was going to be bored. And that's what it was. So this kind of restlessness and then this stubbornness with like figuring out how to get out of that sensation of being bored allowed me to make that break. But it was also the commute, like I said, it was moving. I think that a lot of the shifts have often coincided with physical movement. I've moved around a lot from place to place. And for professional reasons, for personal family reasons. And each time I move, there is a kind of a break that's natural. And that first break coincided with actually leaving New York City and kind of getting some space from that. Once I did that, I think it's just, I've learned to trust it. Yeah, but I'm always kind of experimenting. You know, I show a progression, and I've said this previous talks, like there's a lot that's left out. You know, obviously there's like a lot of sort of gray area in between, or like failures or things that do lead from one thing to another, but that are kind of in the corner or in the trash can. Yeah.
Great. We have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about the shift in physical scale with your work, and how is that in relation to changing mediums?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I I think within each of the mediums, I've kind of tended to work in a range of scales. Um, so I find that I'm most comfortable working in a kind of a smallish format and then a really large format, and the sort of in between is harder for me. And so that tends to be where I go. So the works that you're seeing in this photo here are more on the small end of the spectrum. But what I'm making now is more like, I guess, like this piece. This piece is, I didn't really say the sizes, but 54 by 45 inches. So it's pretty large. I mean, this is, given the slowness of the process, this is quite large, but I'm actually working on some larger ones now because I feel like now that I'm sort of, I've made a lot of discoveries about this process and how it works. I want to take it to a larger scale. Like the early figurative paintings were more like 6 feet. And then the collage based paintings got to be like 6 feet. And that's kind of where I feel like I want to go with this work too. There's a lot, especially with this new work, there's a lot that can only happen at that large scale because of the scale of the yarn and the vertical warps. Like with a small piece, you can't, I'm going to go back to one in particular here, this one. So you see this big opening created by the tension of the weaving. Like that's something that's only possible once the work gets to be a certain size, because when it's too small, like these smaller ones, like, you know, there's an opening there, but it's not as dramatic. So there's things that come with this work I'm learning only with the larger scale. But I think there's interesting things that happen at the small scale too. It's like a different set of problems to solve. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but
Yeah, it's a great answer. So, I have noticed also in these more recent works, or actually a good portion of your works, you maintain a vertical orientation. And I'm curious if that's purposeful, if you have thoughts around that, or if it's something that just feels right within the navigation of the works.
yeah, that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot because I'm trying to make some horizontal pieces right now, and I'm having a hard time. I think it's just must be, for some reason it's easier for me. I mean, I do think that I am thinking a lot about the body still. So the portrait is, you know, historically a vertical format, and there is something about the symmetry of the body and the verticality of it that that I'm tapping into, I think. Some of the early body of work were horizontal because they were more like situated in a landscape space. But I'm not really so interested in the kind of horizons or the landscape kind of structure at this point. And I'm often dealing with kind of these flat planes that are kind of stacking to create depth in this work. And for whatever reason, the vertical really seems more successful for that. But I do think it's also, again, the verticality of the warps lends itself to this kind of composition that's up down as opposed to expansive. So what I'm sort of playing with now with trying to make horizontal works is how to maintain a vertical feeling in a horizontal canvas, which is just a different problem to solve. Yeah.
Great. We have a new question from Sarah who said, you said at one point, moving into the cut collage pieces, that it was the freedom or answer to the next step in a natural progression of your work. Can you expand on that? And did you feel the same way when you found weaving in your paintings?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the cut paper pieces, the moment of cutting them up and realizing I could kind of release a new kind of energy from the old paintings just felt like it felt like it opened up such a new sense of possibility because I mean I was still struggling at that point with trying to move beyond the figurative work. I think I was kind of piling things up in compositions and layering them, but I still hadn't figured out how to kind of fully move beyond that language. And the cutting became this way to kind of um, free the images that I was working with to become something else. And I do think that the weaving has had a similar kind of I've had a similar kind of feeling about it where because weave structures have their own that there's this sort of spontaneous aesthetics, like I said in that statement I wrote, where like once you like establish a structure, some kind of pattern emerges automatically just by following that structure. And it allows me to find a different kind of image than the one I would come up with by looking at a source material or invention or whatever would come from me. It feels like it's this kind of collaboration with some sort of outside force, I guess, in the same way that the cutting felt like. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always, like, since I, made this break to move away from this very intentional figurative narrative-based practice, I've had this desire to move into something unknown that I can't preconceive. And I think the cutting and the weaving both help me to do that.
So, you're referencing this really lovely improvisational approach. However, you're sticking it right against this really ordered and strict kind of mode that weaving requires, but also being within a rectangle requires. And so I'm curious, how is it that you are approaching your day in the studio? Like, do you have a method that you always approach, or do you try and break that method to ensure that you don't create too much of a pattern for yourself?
I think I'm always trying to break it. And that's the pleasure and the challenge of the way that I work. There's no formula. Like I'm never interested in finding a formula because I become less interested. I'm not interested anymore. But that means there's a lot of failure. And I didn't really talk about this, but with these pieces that I'm making now, there are times when I will make a painting, set up the weaving, weave for a week or two, and then have to just like take the whole thing off because it just doesn't work. Because it's not like every weaving decision I make with the painting is going to work. It's like it has to be a very specific conversation between the two. And I'm kind of always looking around the corner to find what the next conversation might be. And that's what keeps me interested, though, even though it's hard. But yeah, I mean, each piece will take several weeks or a month to make. So my studio practice kind of like goes through a lot of different rhythms. Like when I'm working on weaving something, I'm just going in every day and just working on that piece. And it's very slow. But once I get to a certain point with the piece where I need to set it aside and let it have some space, before I know what to do next, then I may go into a painting, which may be like really fast. I'm on my feet and painting. It's rapid decisions. And that kind of variety is also part of what I love about this process.
How then do you identify when a work is unsuccessful or successful, or however you might want to word that?
It's a feeling. I mean, it's hard to quantify it. I mean, what I've been doing recently is I'll work on a piece until I feel like something starts to transform, like something gets activated that like the painting that I had started with becomes unrecognizable in some way. Like it really starts to shift. And that may be like a spatial shift or yeah, often it has to do with the way the space is functioning, I think. And once it starts to do something that feels like it's talking to me, then I'll put it aside and then let it sit and decide whether it needs anything else or not. That's really what I'm looking for. The artist Donna Nelson, she's a painter whose work I really love and her approach I really admire. She talks about it in terms of finding the image. She'll work, she throws stuff at the canvas, she works in layers, she does, pours things, and she just keeps doing that until all of a sudden there's a presence or an image. And then she stops. And that's kind of the way that I think about it too. I don't really know where the end point is, but if that starts to happen, if some kind of presence or image appears, then that's successful. Sometimes though, it just gets duller and duller, and that's when it's not successful, That's when I know it has to be torn apart or put aside. But I'll go back, actually, this one piece I showed you before. This one, which I really love. This is actually one I keep thinking about now. It's in the current show. And I want to kind of explore some of the things that are happening in this piece in new works. But for months, I just thought this was trash. It was in the corner. I wasn't even going to pull it out to show anyone. And then I pulled it out one day and I thought, oh, I can see it with fresh eyes. And it was unknown to me. I think that's why it felt very unfamiliar, but once I gave it time, it revealed itself.
I love that. I think that that's actually perhaps the very best place for us to stop. So I want to thank you, Jen, again for the generosity of your time and talent. And thank you for joining us, everyone, for this artist talk as a part of our programming series for Shared State. I'd like to give a special thank you to the curators, Jordan and Natalie, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.